Very much, Ron, for finding those for me. Just to say, thanks also for inviting me to come and speak today. It's a real pleasure. It's particularly nice to see some old friends and also to put faces to names or people that I've just communicated with by email, including Mark from Australia. So that's really great. As Simone said, I'm just today my purpose is just to try and give a very quick initial overview of some of the findings that are coming out of the health and wellbeing survey that we did recently. We're right in the middle of all the analysis, so you'll have to bear with me and accept that these are just very sort of headlines really, but hopefully we'll have a lot more detail by Christmas, so well before that actually in November. So I thought it might help just to refresh everybody's memories about why the Trust wanted to actually do the health and wellbeing survey. So the overall aim was very much to get a better picture of the current situation or circumstances for beneficiaries, and particularly the kinds of challenges that people were facing or that people felt they would face in the coming years. And the purpose of that was to sort of help the Trust think about how it might want to develop its services, but also enable the Trust to demonstrate to the Departments of Health the sort of health-related issues that people are facing, and hopefully therefore make the case for the continuation of the health grant when that comes in for review at the end of the 10-year period. And lastly, I know in 2016 there were negotiations with Diageo, so hopefully the information from the survey will contribute to that as well. So I won't go into lots of methodological boring details, but just to briefly say what we did. The survey had sort of 10 main sections, which you can see there, and I won't go into all of those in detail today because some of the things we're still doing the analysis on, but I'll just touch on some of the main areas. And the survey went out to all 467 beneficiaries, including beneficiaries living abroad and those beneficiaries who perhaps have a solicitor or a family member acting for them. So it was absolutely everybody. And people could respond by post, online, or I could complete it over the telephone with people if they preferred to do that. And all three methods were used, although the post was the main one. And we had an absolutely fantastic response. Over 75% of you responded to the survey. And I think I have a big thanks to say to Michelle, Jane and the team at the Thalidomide Trust office, who I think reminded everybody. And also to beneficiaries like Roland, I think, who put things on Facebook and encouraged responses. So that's really super. And we asked if people would be willing to give their names on the survey so that we could, get back to people or track things back. But obviously we appreciated that some of the information we were asking for was quite sensitive, and so people had the option to complete it anonymously. But only 13% of people did, so I think that's, it's really nice that people felt there was sufficient trust to give their names. And just to say that it was pretty even split, 169 women and 171 men. And for some reason, 11 people didn't give me their gender, but I don't know why. I'm not going to go into that. We did have a really good response. So just the first area I wanted to cover was just a little bit about housing and adaptations, which, because I know as Anne was saying, I think that's quite a hot topic, it's going to be a hot topic in the coming years. Interesting, the majority of beneficiaries, 85% of you, live in your own house or flat, so that's, I think that's the security that gives, I think, is great for people. But around a third of people were planning adaptations to the home in the coming year. 80 odd people were looking at major adaptations and a smaller number minor adaptations. But also, interestingly, there were a proportion of people who just felt they couldn't afford to do the adaptations they would like to do in the coming years. So there were still lots of people feeling that they couldn't do everything that they really need to do. I think it was also interesting that around half the people who responded to the survey thought it was likely that they might need to move house in the coming 5 years. And the biggest reasons for that were to have a home without stairs, or to have a home that was more fully adapted to their needs. But also, in some cases, just having a smaller or more manageable house and garden. Interestingly, although it was a minority, there were 14 people who said that they felt they would need to move home so that they would have accommodation for a living personal assistant, and a number of people who needed a bigger home, perhaps to accommodate a wheelchair or to live with a family member. So whilst the numbers are small, I think for those people that's a really big, it's a really big issue. So it was useful to sort of get that detail from people. We also asked about work and pensions, and I know there's a group particularly looking at this at the moment. So just to sort of give you a sense here, I think it's all in colour. There were around 40% of people were currently not working because of their disability or health problems, and another sort of 12% had reduced their working hours because of their disability or health problems. And I think that contrasts with what Caroline was presenting this morning from the German study. So the proportion of people in this country who are not working because of their health problems was is much greater. But interestingly, around 2/3 of the people who responded said that they'd changed their working situation since the year 2000. Either they'd given up work, or they'd reduced their working hours, or they'd changed their jobs. So I think, the last 10-15 years has seen a lot of changes for people. And we just asked one question about pensions, which was just whether people had contributed to a private pension or an employer's pension over and above their, your normal state pension. And only 1/3 of people said that they had any sort of private pension arrangements. So, I think that's quite significant. So just moving on to current and recent health problems, and again I think this echoes some of the things that Caroline was touching on this morning. The survey showed that 93% of the people who responded to the survey, so the overwhelming majority of people, were experiencing pain or loss of movement in one or more joints, and lots of people ticked multiple areas. So it wasn't just it's just my knee or it's just my hip, or the people often ticked several areas. So I think that's a really big issue for people. We also asked people about generalised pain, and again nearly half of you were saying that you are experiencing generalised pain. Sometimes that was severe and continuous, and sometimes it was it was more intermittent, but nevertheless it was a big feature for a lot of people. And nearly 3/4 of people reported some neurological symptoms. So what we were talking about earlier about the tingling, loss of feeling, and heat and cold. So again, that was a common feature for folks. I think the other statistic which kind of really struck me, because I know in the North Rhine-Westphalia study they'd estimated that over 50% of their study respondents had some mental health problems, or were currently experiencing mental health problems or had done recently, and that seemed an awfully high figure to me. When I read it, I thought, that can't be right. But actually, from what you've reported to us in this survey, 50% of people in the beneficiary community have recently had some mental health problems like depression or anxiety. So I think that's going to be a really important, as we get into the analysis, I think that's going to be a really important area to look at in more detail and look at people's circumstances and so on. I think on the positive side, 74 people said that their health and well-being had actually improved in recent years, and the big reasons for that were weight loss or healthier eating and so on. Medical treatments, which included things like pain medication and in some instances surgery, but also exercise and people making choices about regular treatments like massage. So I think the health grants certainly enable people to do that. We also asked people a little bit about their use of health services and some of the experiences they've had of using health services. And again, this is something that I think we'll be able to look at in more detail, but just to give you a flavour of it, there were a relatively small but significant number of people had some kind of joint or back surgery. And I know from the qualitative work that we've done previously around the health grant that people face some really difficult decisions about whether surgery was a good option for them or not. So I think there's some really hard choices to make there. Half of you told us that you were using prescription pain medication or had had pain relieving treatments like injections and so on. Physiotherapy or complementary therapies were a common service that people were using, a great majority, as I say, 69%. But interestingly as well, nearly a third of people had some kind of treatment for mental health problems, including counselling. And I think it's interesting that the number of people reporting they've got mental health problems or have had them recently, and the number of people seeking treatment is a bit adrift, and maybe that's because people don't feel comfortable, seeking treatment and needing help. The other thing that we asked about was whether people had any difficulties with the quality or access to health services. And as you can see from there, the two big issues, I think, were generally health professionals not really understanding the nature of thalidomide damage or not understanding the very specific nature of people's impairments. So I think they were the big concerns for people. But also people reported not being able to see a suitably qualified or experienced clinician and associated with that delays getting treatment. And again, I think this is something that we'll try and look at in a little bit more depth, because hopefully that will be helpful to Dee and colleagues in the HealthLink team. So I'm just going to touch very briefly on social care, because we need to look at a little bit more detail at this. But I think for me, I was quite surprised at the number of respondents who were actually reported that they were getting local authority funded social care. And I don't know, there may be a variety of issues for that which we need to look at, but whether there is perhaps some reluctance to seek help from social care services, because of the sort of bureaucracy of it and so on. And of those that were getting help, getting local authority social care, it was about 50-50 of people said they felt that they were getting enough help, and 50% saying that they felt they could really do with more. And a small proportion of people were in any case topping up what they were getting. And of the beneficiaries, the majority of beneficiaries who were not getting any local authority funded social care, a high proportion, nearly 2/3, were buying in their own support, which ranged from personal assistance to help in the home, gardening, DIY, etc. So a big proportion of people were spending health grant or other money on that kind of thing. And a fair number thought that they might need to seek additional support in the future. I'm getting the 5 minute one. I'm nearly there. So just homing in on some of the mental well-being issues briefly. In the survey, we used two what they call sort of validated questionnaires. So basically, they're standard questionnaires that mean that we can compare the results for thalidomiders with the general population or with people, with other conditions. So I think some of you will know that we've previously compared to things like stroke or MS. So one of the surveys we're using, which is called SF12, which is a really horrible, complicated one that you had to fill in. We haven't done the analysis of that yet, so we're still working on it. But we also use something, another survey, which is the one that you see here, which is one that's been used quite a lot in the national census and things like that. So you can see where people are scoring badly on those things, and so it just but the three sort of least good areas, if you like, were people feeling relaxed, people feeling useful, and people feeling optimistic about the future. And I think there's some really important messages there which link to sort of the issues around mental health and so on. And I'll keep whizzing on. And so just keeping with this sort of emotional well-being theme and the social and people's social lives, I think it's interesting. We asked people about their emotional well-being and how it was compared to 5 years ago. And nearly half the people responding to the survey said that they felt it was worse or much worse than 5 years ago. So I think, again, that's quite an important finding. But on the upside, you were obviously, a lot of you have got a good social lives, so most people felt their social lives were pretty good. Having said that, I think perhaps what's important is not the majority who have got a good social networks, as Mark was talking about earlier, but rather the people who do feel socially isolated, and I think part of the analysis is going to be looking at that in a little bit more detail and understanding what's happening for those groups of beneficiaries who are struggling and who are finding it difficult. Yeah, nearly there. So just two last slides. So quickly just to say, we asked people just a very broad question about what their future concerns were. And I mean, I suppose in some ways there's no surprises, but the three main concerns that people had were people's emotional health, physical health and mobility, but also, you know, beginning to have to use personal assistance, I think was another issue. And I think that really what we think is valuable about this question was really to sort of give us some pointers to the different topics, and hopefully for those of you who said you'd be willing to contribute to further work, come back to you and talk to you about some of these things in more depth. So just one last slide. This just to let you know what's happening next with it all. So as I say, we're currently analysing the data at the moment. There's lots more to do, but I'm obviously working with colleagues at the Trust about that. But also, I know that from the NAC and from the Research Committee and so on, I know some of you have got particular topics that you're interested in. So Craig and I have been talking about mental well-being, and Liz and I have been talking about pensions and work. So, you know, if anyone does have a particular interest in something and you want to make suggestions or ideas and say, could we look at a certain thing, then please do feel free to say that, because we want the survey to be useful. It's got to, that's its whole point really. So the first draft of the report will go to the Research Committee in November, and then a second draft will go to the trustees in January, and then hopefully we're sort of aiming for the report to be finalised and I guess hopefully available to people in about February time. So that's the sort of rough timeline that we're working to. So thanks very much, folks.
Much.